The Seventh Continent was an enormous hit for French publisher Serious Poulp, a fantastic exploration-style board game that could be played solo or cooperatively with a group of up to 4 players. And with its inspiration coming from a variety of different mediums, including classic choose-your-own-adventure books and adventure video games like Monkey Island and Myst, if nothing else, The Seventh Continent was able to meld these unique experiences into a single analog board game that presented its players with a constant sense of exploration and discovery throughout its hundreds of hours of gameplay. Now, 3 years after its initial release, the original design team is back at it with its follow-up title, The Seventh Citadel, a slightly more gritty, darker fantasy adventure whose gameplay and mechanics, from what little I've experienced just with this introductory scenario, have significantly improved upon the original game in a number of different ways. Now, before I get too far along, I did want to mention that although this is coming to Kickstarter, and this is an early look at the game, the video you're watching here today is 100% unsponsored and unpaid for in any way. And my opinions today about the Seventh Continent, and more importantly about the Seventh Citadel, are entirely my own. It should also be noted that I have played just a very, very small fraction of the total game in its prototype form, which is what you're seeing here today. And that for obvious reasons, I can only comment about my personal experiences when comparing the two games together, knowing full well that things may change as the game gets further along development. So let's get right to the point by discussing what I've personally had the chance to play thus far, which was just that introductory scenario that I mentioned. And when you think of the Seventh Citadel, you need to think of it a little bit differently than you did the Seventh Continent. You see, the Seventh Continent broke apart each of its adventures into individual curses, which encapsulated a single hours-long mystery on the island. The Seventh Citadel, on the other hand, uses multiple hours-long scenarios that are all tied together within a single threat. And the distinction between these two is important to understand, as I will be discussing scenarios and how they make up the pieces of a larger threat throughout the rest of this video. Right now, I'm aware of 2 existing threats that are shipping with the Kickstarter, each containing anywhere between 8 to 12 scenarios per threat, with each scenario taking approximately about 2 hours to complete, which tracks perfectly with my experience with this introductory scenario itself. So, you may be asking yourself why these new multi-link scenarios are such an important change from the one-and-done curses that were used in the original game. Well, the answer to this is because the Seventh Citadel is approaching its adventures or threats with more of a campaign narrative, where your actions and your choices can influence future scenarios within that threat. And all of this is handled and tracked with these Citadel leaflets that are included for each of the threats that you are to undertake, either solo or as a group. Each new threat that the players begin requires them to track their communal achievements for that threat within the multiple pages of this shared leaflet. Contained within these pages are a number of charts and graphs that will open up new paths for players to explore and experience the game in different ways. Some paths are determined by the decisions that the group have made to that particular scenario, while others by the choices on how they wish to grow their party's abilities throughout the threat. For instance, there is Destiny, where players are able to unlock new abilities and skills depending on how they use their earned experience points, and Side Quests, where players track their progress on certain uncovered objectives throughout the threat. 2 of the more intriguing areas within this leaflet are the Fellowship and the Building charts. The Fellowship area tracks players' progress over 4 different stat lines, including defense, production, knowledge, and influence, and will increase and decrease depending upon specific outcomes within the story. More importantly, this track will unlock new cards at specific times, and oftentimes be referred to as a check within a scenario for the group's level in order to meet very specific story conditions. In other words, it's yet another unique way that players will be able to interact with this world differently depending upon their progress and their choices as a group. The Buildings chart, on the other hand, is mostly tied to players' experience and choices that they make within the Destiny chart, but will ultimately allow them to construct buildings that unlock new cards and abilities or improve their Fellowship tracks and much more. With 28 unique buildings, players can always customize their playstyles according to the buildings that they choose to construct. Now, the final thing that I'll mention about the Seventh Citadel in terms of new components is this laminated pocketed map, which is still to me somewhat of a mystery. I was able to complete the introductory scenario, which unlocked the card that you are looking at right now, at which time was conveniently slotted according to the dialogue that I read at the resolution of the scenario. I do know that within a threat that this map will change and provide players with new paths and clues to the ongoing story of this world, and more importantly, the threat that you are undertaking. But how it works entirely is a little bit of an enigma right now, which is cool because I love a nice mystery and look forward to discovering more of this feature as I play through an entire threat to see how it involves the narrative. But before I go, I did want to touch briefly on the gameplay because these new changes are what I believe to be the most important fundamental changes that players are going to enjoy between these two games. The 7th Citadel is very similar to the 7th Continent in a number of gameplay ways, including how it uses its hundreds of square cards as locations and belongings, to being conditions and monsters or cards that have hidden clues on them that players must look carefully to attempt to discover. And again, just like the original game, the 7th Citadel uses your hand and your deck of cards as both your life and as the resolution structure for each of the game's action sequences that you will constantly be challenged with. In other words, if you've played the 7th Continent, much of what you played there can be applied here. However, there are a number of changes that, in my opinion, have made this overall experience much, much better. For one, there are no dice that are to be placed on your belongings that track their slow degradation into uselessness. Items now have permanence, with their only limitation being the keywords that are contained on the cards themselves that you equip. This means that inventory management is much easier to track, and players will spend more of their time discovering the game's many mysteries rather than worrying about burning through their cards and their items too quickly. But probably the biggest and most substantial change to the 7th Citadel is the addition of life counters or hit points for each of the players participating in the game, allowing for far more flexibility and, more importantly, nuance in how you manage your deck of cards. Now, let me explain that. Everyone who is familiar with the 7th Continent knows how scary it was to get near the end of your deck, which in essence was a constant looming in-game timer that continually made players on edge and forced them to make decisions that probably weren't always the best interest of the party, just so that they wouldn't have to shuffle their discard pile and add those dreaded curse cards to their hand. Now, some of the people enjoyed this timed aspect of the game, while many others wanted the experience of the story without having to micromanage every decision that was being made in the interest of time. And in the 7th Citadel, I believe this issue has been addressed. Now, at the start of each scenario, each player is given an X amount of life, and in the introductory scenario, that number was 30. Life would be added or taken away according to the monsters that you fought, the encounters that you had, or the food that you were able to scrounge during a scenario. However, players would always lose 5 health every time that you had to reshuffle your deck in order to draw new cards. On the surface, this may not sound too different than its predecessor, but for me, the change was really apparent in the players' mindsets and how they approach the game. And for me personally, I was able to go through my deck 4 times and ended my scenario with just 6 life left, and it felt perfectly balanced. Never did I feel incredibly stressed for time like I did with the 7th Continent, and exploring new locations always felt like the smart idea. And more importantly, I was very, very comfortable committing more of my cards to an action sequence at times because I constantly knew where I stood with my life and my ability to push forward. All in all, I had an absolute blast with what I played at the 7th Citadel. I love the 7th Continent, but I think that this is going to be a far better experience for gamers as they've listened to the feedback of the community. They've addressed a number of the different concerns and created a deeper yet more streamlined game that now caters to people who are looking for more of a narrative-driven experience across different play sessions, and I can't wait to do that. And that is my unbiased, unpaid-for opinion of the 7th Citadel from Serious Poulp. If you have any questions about the game, please make them in the comments below, and as always, please go to their Kickstarter page for all the final components. And again, thanks for watching. Hey everyone, if you guys enjoyed this video, please consider dinging the old bell below. That is going to help notify you of new videos that are uploaded to our channel. And as always, give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and please consider watching all of our videos, one of which you can see right here to my left.